In just 8 brief minutes in first class, a black man was insulted, humiliated, and told to vacate his seat simply because of his skin color. But when the crew discovered he was the newly appointed federal judge by the president, everything exploded in silence. Will this truth be enough to shatter decades of arrogance and prejudice? JFK Airport. Early in the morning, the air buzzing with the energy of a new day beginning. The first-class area felt like a separate world, a place where businessmen, powerful figures, and the wealthy walked around. The space was luxurious, with modern design featuring soft leather chairs, upscale bars, and digital screens displaying flight announcements and information. Most of the passengers were white, dressed in tailored dark suits, their Rolex watches gleaming, their confident gazes suggesting nothing could shake them. Conversations drifted between talk of important meetings, major business deals, and successes they had achieved and were continuing to enjoy. Everything here radiated opulence, a clear testament to wealth and power. Amid all this grandeur, a solitary figure stepped in. Arthur Vance, 68 years old, was the one person who couldn't blend into this flawless picture. He wore an old, faded coat, trousers wrinkled and worn with time. His old suitcase trailed behind him, starkly different from the sleek luggage surrounding him. His hair was graying, his deep-set eyes filled with memories and life's experiences. Every step he took felt like a stark contrast to the surroundings. But he wasn't in a hurry, nor did he feel the need to explain himself to anyone. He walked into the first-class cabin, his eyes not panicked, just slightly unfamiliar, as if he had grown accustomed to that sense of being out of place over the years. All eyes in the cabin turned toward him. Other passengers couldn't help but notice his entrance. Some turned away, avoiding his gaze, while others couldn't hide their discomfort, glancing at the old suitcase before looking back at each other, their eyes filled with curiosity but also with a hint of prejudice. He paid no attention to these glances. He wasn't surprised, nor was he embarrassed. Arthur Vance walked straight to his seat, sitting down slowly. The feeling of isolation surrounded him, but he didn't mind the people in this cabin, no matter how they looked at him. He had grown too used to it. This was not the first time he had felt like a stranger in a place where he didn't belong. But one question flashed in his mind. Could he find respect here among these people? The first-class cabin was now enveloped in a tense, uneasy silence, a quiet only those new to such an environment could truly feel. Every sound, from the rustling of newspapers to hushed conversations, seemed to vanish the moment Arthur Vance entered. All eyes turned toward him, but not with the warmth of genuine curiosity. Those glances were sharp, laced with judgment and disdain. Passengers exchanged silent looks, their lips sealed but their eyes speaking volumes. What is he doing here? A question rang through the air, though it remained unspoken, hanging like a bell in the atmosphere. Cold, disapproving stares met him, as if they were witnessing a disruption to an order they had come to expect. An old man, dressed in a faded coat and dragging a suitcase more worn than any in the cabin, had appeared in first class, the exclusive space where people paid exorbitant prices to sit. Why him? While some passengers looked on with confusion, a middle-aged couple sitting nearby began to notice a distinct smell, different from the scent of the other passengers around them. A damp, musty odor, the smell of neglected belongings, the scent of poverty, something they had never been forced to confront in their own lives. The wife's eyes widened as she glanced at her husband and whispered, "Do you think it's coming from him?" Her husband nodded silently, saying nothing in response. The wife quickly pulled a perfume bottle from her handbag, spraying a quick burst into the air, hoping to mask the unfamiliar odor that was making them uncomfortable. The spray wasn't just for freshening the air. It was a silent gesture, a subtle act of contempt for the presence of this elderly black man in their pristine, luxurious space. That scene was like a slap in the face to Arthur Vance. He sat there motionless, eyes fixed ahead, with no reaction, no movement. He had lived long enough to understand that in a world like this, discrimination was inevitable. But inside him, a quiet flame of anger began to ignite. Why are they looking at me like this? Why are they treating me like I don't belong here? He wondered, the sting of insult growing sharper. Yet, rather than let those feelings consume him, he remained silent, holding tightly to the frustration and anger rising within him. He wasn't someone easily humiliated, not even by a glance. That simmering anger felt like a fire ready to burst into flames. How much longer would he endure before this injustice met with a defiant response? As Arthur Vance made his way to his seat, a young flight attendant stepped forward, blocking his path. Her face was marked by suspicion, her eyes cold, as if she were staring at someone who didn't belong in this space. Her voice rang out with an emphasis that was hard to miss. "Excuse me, sir, this is first class." The words, though spoken gently, were laced with contempt, as if she couldn't believe that someone like him, a black man, could step into such a luxurious space. It was unspoken discrimination. No clarification was needed. She waited for him to step back, hoping for some concession. But Arthur Vance merely remained silent and slowly pulled out his electronic ticket. The movement was deliberate, calm, but nothing more than an expression of his firm resolve. The attendant looked at the ticket, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if trying to decide whether this was some sort of misunderstanding. Perhaps this ticket belongs to someone else, someone who belongs here more easily? As she glanced over the ticket, she found no error. It was indeed issued to him. But the doubt wouldn't leave her. She took a deep breath, attempting to maintain her professionalism, and then uttered a casual, dismissive line. "Oh, I'm sorry. Please go ahead." It wasn't an apology. It was a reluctant concession, a perfunctory action, as if she was just doing what needed to be done, not truly acknowledging him as an equal passenger like anyone else. As he passed her, a half-smile twisted on her lips. She quietly muttered to a nearby colleague, her contempt unhidden. Weird. Maybe someone bought that ticket for him. That statement echoed like a soothing balm to the doubts that had already formed in her mind. Perhaps this old man didn't deserve to be in first class. Surely he couldn't have bought a first-class ticket himself, could he? Her whisper wasn't just a guess. It was a reflection of the discriminatory system that existed, where people like Arthur Vance were judged and perceived through entirely different standards. Everything became clearer than ever. He wasn't welcome here. Through unconscious attitudes, society had built invisible walls that pushed people like him to the margins, not because they weren't capable, but because their skin color and outward appearance didn't fit the world they had entered. And those glances, those words, were evidence of the discrimination, the judgment that he had endured all his life. Arthur Vance may have lived long enough to understand that this discrimination was inevitable, but the anger within him had never subsided. And now, it was ready to ignite. As Arthur Vance sat down near a group of passengers, his attention was drawn by the gaze of a young white man, around 35 years old, impeccably dressed in an expensive suit and Italian leather shoes. The man paused, his eyes fixing on Arthur before a sneer crept across his face. He let out a loud laugh, unmistakably mocking, and said, "Is this seat part of some special deal for the unemployed?" His words weren't just a harmless joke. They were a systemic mockery, a reminder that people like Arthur, those without expensive clothes, without the right appearance, without the right to exist in such a space, were viewed as a threat. The man didn't care for the presence of an elderly black man, someone society had already placed beyond the bounds of this world, beyond the threshold of such exclusivity. Immediately, the words spread through the cabin. The passengers around them exchanged glances, unable to hide their amusement at seeing someone else being brought low. The sarcasm quickly spread like a mental virus. Without hesitation, everyone burst into laughter. It wasn't just a laugh over a joke. It was laughter rooted in complicity, in accepting the norms of discrimination and judgment, a belief that class, race, and power divisions were an inseparable part of society. They didn't just laugh at a comment. They laughed because they had found a weakness in someone society had already pushed to the bottom, a man who had no right to be there in the first place. Arthur Vance, still silent, could feel the rage rise within him, clear and undeniable. The anger was overwhelming. This direct insult made him feel as though he had been humiliated, crushed under a system in which he had never truly belonged. He didn't need to speak, didn't need to reply, but inside, a fire of anger began to burn stronger than ever before. His emotions weren't just about personal insult. They tapped into the collective pain of an entire community treated unjustly. Each laugh, each glance, carried the ghost of a society that had never fully let go of its racial prejudices. But it was this very sarcasm, this public mockery and ridicule, That became the spark to ignite the fire of provocation as he realized he couldn't sit quietly and silently any longer. The mockery didn't stop there. A middle-aged woman seated to Arthur's right couldn't help herself when she looked at him. She gazed at Arthur Vance with a look of contempt before letting out a remark that struck like a knife to his heart. He must have picked up his ticket in the parking lot and just climbed up here. Her words weren't just an offhand comment. They were a humiliation, a statement affirming that a man like him, someone without luxury, without expensive clothes, without an appearance that fit the standard of the elite, had absolutely no right to be in this space. Her words pierced deep into his pride like a sharp blade, cutting through everything he had endured. What was even more frightening than the comment was the silence from those around him. No one spoke out. Not a single person stood up to defend Arthur Vance. No one seemed outraged by this blatant insult. They simply sat there, exchanging glances calmly, as if everything was as it should be, as if people like him didn't belong in the first-class cabin of a commercial flight. Arthur Vance sat there, feeling each word, each glance like a wound tearing at his soul. The anger inside him grew stronger. The feeling of being insulted and belittled crushed his heart more than ever. He felt like an outsider, a person who had no right to be in this space. He looked around, feeling each disdainful glance from the other passengers who remained seated, indifferent and cold. The mockery felt like sharp knives, the mocking eyes devoid of any sympathy. They weren't just mocking him, they were mocking everyone like him. Those forgotten by society, those who had no right to speak out, those living under the shadow of racism and injustice. The coldness in the first-class cabin now felt unbearable for Arthur Vance. The silence wasn't just a natural reaction, it was complicity. The feeling of being ostracized, humiliated, and regarded as an outsider was no longer something he could bear. The fire of anger inside him was burning stronger than ever. Those words, like a sharp knife, didn't just hurt him. They pushed him into an unbearable sense of discomfort and tension that wouldn't let go. With every passing second, he felt like he was being suffocated, abandoned in a society where he had no power to change anything. All the mockery, the complicity of silence, and the suffocating atmosphere in first class seemed to have reached the breaking point for one person. A black man sitting at the back of the cabin, who had remained silent up until then, could no longer bear it. He stood up, his movement strong, decisive, yet controlled. His eyes met every face in the cabin, and his words felt like a line drawn between silence and an eruption. "Aren't you all ashamed?" His voice rang out, strong and challenging. The unexpected, sudden words broke the silence that had hung over the cabin. The passengers around him began to turn, their expressions shifting from indifference to surprise and discomfort. Arthur Vance, still seated, realized that not everyone around him was in agreement with what was happening. A wave of quiet anger, though simmering beneath the surface, could no longer be ignored. And now, the only person brave enough to stand up for his dignity was the stranger at the back of the cabin. But as soon as the words left his mouth, a flight attendant standing nearby quickly walked over, her face tense and unhappy, her tone growing cold and warning. "If you continue to make a scene, I'll have to call security." Her tone, the indifference toward a clear act of injustice, only made the atmosphere more tense. The flight attendant's words were not just a casual warning. They were a form of oppression, an endorsement of the racism playing out right before their eyes. She showed no concern or empathy for the actions of those around her, but instead directly threatened the only person who dared to speak out. The black man stood firm, unyielding. He knew full well that in this cabin, he meant nothing. He could be branded a troublemaker, thrown out of the cabin simply for speaking his truth. Yet he still spoke up. It was an act not just for Arthur Vance, but for all those who had been choked into silence, those who had long lost hope that anyone would stand up against injustice. Arthur Vance, though still seated, looked at him with respect and gratitude. His dignity, though bruised, found a spark of hope in the fact that someone wasn't afraid to stand up and speak the truth that the entire first-class cabin and society itself had been trying to forget. The tension in the air now felt like a storm ready to break. Every person in the cabin realized that the emotional current of anger could no longer be contained. One thing was clear, this battle was far from over. The entire first-class cabin, which had been filled with mocking laughter and insults just moments before, now fell into a deep silence. The silence that enveloped the space was not one of peace. It was a dangerous silence, a deathly stillness like the calm before a storm. Every eye, after the biting words and mockery, now turned toward Arthur Vance. Mr. Vance, the 68-year-old black man, remained seated. His body was still, his hands clenched tightly onto the armrests of his seat. His head bowed, his gaze fixed on the window. It was as if he was looking at something far beyond, somewhere no one could see. But his eyes, though silent, were full of harshness. A quiet fire burned deep within him, waves of anger rising stronger in his chest, still unburdened. But everything around him signaled it was about to reach a point of no return. When Arthur fell silent, everything seemed off. A frightening stillness took over the cabin. The passengers around him no longer dared to laugh, no longer dared to whisper. They sensed a threat they couldn't quite define in the air. This silence, this tense stillness, was the moment when everyone felt a growing sense of unease. Every movement, every breath from him now carried the potential to trigger something unimaginable. A man had stood up to fight for what was right, even in the face of weakness, even after being mocked and belittled. And now, his silence was merely the acceptance of the pressure from all sides, from the eyes that waited for an eruption. But what they didn't know was that Arthur wasn't someone who could easily explode. His silence was the rising anger, a flame ready to burst forth. And when it did, nothing would be the same anymore. One could only feel it. The air in this first-class cabin was becoming suffocating. Something was quietly building up, and everyone knew that once Arthur started to act, there would be no way to stop him. The first-class cabin, once luxurious, now felt like nothing more than a facade, a thin veil masking the contempt for someone who didn't belong to this world. The flight attendants, who had always moved with blank expressions, now passed by Arthur Vance with disinterest, as if he didn't even exist in this space. Their eyes never met his. They deliberately avoided looking at him, entirely dismissing his presence as though he were a ghost. Arthur sat still, but inside, his anger was boiling over. Every time a flight attendant passed him without stopping, the fire inside him burned stronger, as though he were being provoked once again. Their cold, dismissive glances made it clear they were intentionally denying him the respect given to any other passenger. The simmering anger within him was building up, and he knew it couldn't continue like this for much longer. Arthur couldn't take it anymore. First, a soft press on the call button, a simple request, but no one came. The silence stretched on, seemingly endless. But in that silence, something was rising within him, an uncontrollable force. The anger was accumulating like a storm about to break. Every passing second felt like a wave of rage crashing against the dam inside him. He looked around, and no one paid him any attention. No one even bothered to acknowledge his presence. They just walked past, continuing their work, going about their indifferent lives within this space. But Arthur knew this wasn't accidental. This was deliberate ignorance, a way of making him understand. You don't deserve attention. You don't belong in this cabin. A new wave of anger surged within him. Arthur's eyes darkened, his hands gripping the edge of the table once more. He had been disrespected for too long, and the way they treated him today was the last straw. 20 minutes passed, but the silence in the first-class cabin felt like an eternity. The luxurious setting that had once seemed like a sanctuary of wealth and power now felt like an oppressive cage. The air grew thick with tension, every second amplifying the sense of neglect, indifference, and disdain. Arthur Vance, still sitting motionless, felt as if the world had forgotten he existed, that he had become invisible in the very space where he had every right to be. The flight attendants, who had once seemed indifferent but polite, now moved past him with cold disregard. Their eyes never meeting his, they walked past him as though he were nothing more than a mere shadow in the corner of the cabin, a ghost who wasn't meant to be seen or acknowledged. He sat still, but inside, his fury simmered. Every time a flight attendant brushed past him, a flash of rage ignited within. The lack of any acknowledgement, the blatant disrespect, felt like another barb, another layer of humiliation. His grip tightened on the armrest, but still, he said nothing. The anger coiled within him, thick and painful, as the pressure built up. He had never felt so deliberately excluded, so targeted for something as simple as existing in a space that he had every right to occupy. The silence dragged on, oppressive and suffocating. Arthur Vance pressed the call button gently, hoping that someone would finally acknowledge him. But nothing happened. The minutes stretched, and no one came. It wasn't the first time his presence had been ignored, but the sheer force of the indifference now felt like a slap across his face. The world around him seemed to move, but he was stuck, held in place by the weight of invisible barriers, invisible prejudices that no one seemed willing to confront. The silence wasn't just a void. It was a calculated form of oppression, a way to remind him that he was never meant to be here. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the flight attendant returned. This time, she wasn't smiling, nor was there any trace of politeness in her demeanor. Her face bore an expression of annoyance, as though this simple task had become something she was far too tired to handle. Her eyes avoided his, and when she stood in front of him, she folded her arms tightly, looking down at him with that unmistakable disdain. She didn't even bother with the typical formalities. Her voice, when it came, was dripping with sarcasm and mockery. "Maybe you're more accustomed to snacks than gourmet French first-class food," she said, her words punctuated by a clear sneer. The insult wasn't just about his food preferences. It was a clear, sharp, cutting statement of his place in the world. He didn't belong here, and she was going to remind him of that in the most public way possible. The words landed like a cold, searing knife into Arthur's chest. It wasn't just a casual insult. It was an attack on his very existence. He was being told in no uncertain terms that he didn't deserve to be in this space, that he was less than the others around him. It wasn't even about the food. It was about everything: his presence, his being, his right to occupy this space. The flight attendant didn't just ridicule him. She was declaring that he had no place among the people she considered her peers. As the words rang out, a tense silence fell over the cabin. Arthur Vance's gaze hardened, his eyes narrowing with an intensity that could have pierced steel. The insult had struck a deep, raw nerve, but he said nothing. His anger was now bubbling just beneath the surface, yet his voice remained silent. He simply looked back at her, not with words, but with a gaze that spoke volumes. It was a look that cut deeper than anything she could say. He wasn't just a man sitting in a seat. He was a man who had lived long enough to understand the cruelty of the world and, more importantly, the silent strength that came from refusing to let others define him. As the flight attendant stood there, she failed to notice the young man sitting nearby. The young man, who had been quietly observing, now saw an opportunity to add another layer of degradation to the moment. He discreetly pulled out his phone and began recording, his eyes gleaming with excitement at the spectacle of a man being humiliated before him. His actions were subtle, almost imperceptible to those around him, but the phone's lens secretly captured every moment of Arthur's suffering. The flight attendant remained oblivious to the fact that the situation was now being recorded for posterity. The others in the cabin, too, remained silent, their eyes locked on the scene unfolding before them. No one spoke, no one protested. Instead, they watched the spectacle unfold, caught in the strange allure of witnessing someone else's humiliation. Arthur's eyes shifted toward the young man, catching a glimpse of the phone aimed in his direction. His heart raced, not with fear, but with a surge of outrage and clarity. This wasn't just about him anymore. This wasn't just about the insult from the flight attendant. It was about something larger, something systemic. They weren't just mocking him. They were mocking everything he represented, everything that people like him had fought against. The flight attendant wasn't just an individual. She was a reflection of the system that had spent centuries telling people like Arthur that they didn't belong, that they were invisible. He met her gaze once more, the mocking tone in her voice, the camera recording every second of his discomfort, the coldness of the passengers around him. It all came together in that moment. Arthur's silence wasn't submission. His silence was the calm before a storm that had been brewing for far too long. His fury simmered, but he did not rise to the bait. Instead, he stared at her, his expression unreadable, but his eyes full of unspoken defiance. The rest of the cabin sat in awkward stillness. The only sounds were the hum of the engines and the faint clicks of the recording device capturing each moment, each second of injustice. Arthur remained seated, his posture rigid, but his mind was anything but still. The confrontation, though subtle, was inevitable. And when the moment arrived, it would not be with a burst of anger, but with the quiet certainty that he would not remain silent forever. The tension in the air thickened. It was clear to everyone that the moment of reckoning was fast approaching, but no one knew just when or how it would explode. But one thing was certain. Arthur Vance wasn't just a man sitting quietly in first class. He was a man who had reached his limit, and when the storm broke, it would be impossible to ignore. The first-class cabin was deathly quiet. Despite every eye being locked on Arthur, no one dared speak. The air was thick with anticipation, as if everyone was waiting for something to happen. Arthur, the black man, still sat there, his hands clutching the armrests of his seat, but not out of fear or submission. He was restraining his emotions. Then, suddenly, a calm voice broke the silence. Arthur, his voice soft yet filled with power, spoke. "Do you think because I'm black, dressed simply, I don't deserve to be treated with respect?" His words echoed like a pointed accusation, full of pent-up frustration. Each word carried the weight of pain, of anger that had been building through a journey of disrespect. His eyes, though calm, reflected a deep, unyielding resolve. His question acted like a mirror, reflecting back the discrimination he was enduring, a question filled with the contempt and injustice he had faced all his life. The flight attendant heard his question, but instead of feeling regret or being moved, she laughed coldly. Her laugh was full of contempt, not a laugh of amusement, but a laugh that mocked, belittled his very existence. She responded, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "I think there are places more suited for certain people." That answer landed like a painful stab, not to his body, but to his soul. She didn't just insult him. She stripped away his most basic human rights, the right to be treated with dignity, the right to be respected, the right to be himself in any situation. The cabin fell silent, but this time, no one laughed. The air in the cabin seemed colder than ever. Even though no one spoke, they could all feel Arthur's rage, a rage that had reached its limit, ready to explode at any moment. Arthur didn't respond immediately. The silence stretched on, but his gaze was no longer one of restraint. It was like a heavy stone pressing down on the injustice he was facing. Though he said nothing more, he had done something no one else dared to do. He confronted the discrimination head-on and exposed the truth she couldn't deny. The first-class cabin, once a symbol of luxury, was now filled with a heavy silence laden with mockery and pain. The shrill sound of laughter still echoed from the passengers, unable to contain their amusement at the flight attendant's provocation and Arthur's helplessness. But for Arthur, that laughter was nothing more than a dull noise, too weak to shake his composure. He stared at her for a long time, his gaze not one of anger but of cold indifference, filled with contempt. Though he didn't say anything more, he leaned forward just slightly and spoke in a quiet voice, one that cut deep like a sharp knife. "You're embarrassing yourself." A short phrase, but it was the key that unlocked a door of truth and defiance. His words seemed to strip away the falsehoods, exposing the dark side of the society that he was forced to confront. It wasn't that he wasn't angry, but that he was controlling his anger, refusing to let it dictate his actions. His words acted like both a warning and a subtle resistance, calm but full of purpose. The flight attendant, though she might have been used to situations like this, now felt as though she had been exposed, unmasked by someone she never imagined would speak up. She could only shrug, attempting to smile it off, but she couldn't escape his unwavering gaze. His silence, however, wasn't one of submission. It was patience, the kind that foreshadowed an eruption. All the eyes in the cabin shifted from mockery to suspicion. Everyone knew after those words that Arthur Vance was not an old man who simply took abuse. They began to rethink the man in front of them. There was something in his eyes, something calculating, something that seemed to be planning, strategizing, but none of them could figure out what. The rest of the passengers continued laughing, but the air was no longer as lighthearted as before. Their laughter began to fade as they realized Arthur was not someone who could be easily defeated. They didn't know it, but he was preparing to expose a system, and that wasn't simply a warning anymore. The first-class cabin had become suffocating as everyone around realized they might be witnessing a turning point, a change that none of them dared to imagine. As for Arthur, there was no smile, no unnecessary movement. He simply sat in silence, waiting for his moment. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin had completely shifted. The laughter and mockery were no longer present. Instead, a heavy silence filled the air, as if a storm was building up before it broke. Every eye was now fixed on Arthur Vance, as if he were becoming a strange object in an unfamiliar world that no one wanted to accept. A passenger, a young man in an expensive suit, suddenly stood up, his eyes filled with suspicion. No one paid attention to him, but moments later, he moved toward the flight attendant, his face full of concern. He leaned in, speaking in a low voice. "I suspect the man over there is acting suspiciously." The flight attendant, although she paused for a moment to glance at Arthur, said nothing. She merely nodded, as if she had encountered such situations before, and responded softly, "We'll deal with it when we land." Just one sentence, yet it was like an order for all the passengers around, causing them to begin avoiding Arthur. The feeling of isolation and rejection started to envelop him. He wasn't someone who didn't feel the eyes avoiding him, the mocking whispers behind his back. Arthur sat still, saying nothing, but inside, anger began to rise. These small actions, from the contemptuous laughs to the indirect pressure, made him feel as though he wasn't even allowed to exist in this space. It was as though everyone had collectively pushed him into the shadows and ignored his presence. His mind swirled with a tangle of thoughts filled with frustration, but he chose to remain silent, to restrain himself. The anger that was building up inside him felt like a ticking time bomb, just waiting to explode. He was no longer the calm, gentle old man. He had reached his breaking point, and the actions of those around him only fueled the fire of anger within. He could not take it any longer, and in that moment, he knew that he would not remain silent for much longer. The storm in the first-class cabin was growing stronger. What had started as light mockery had now turned into heavy tension that everyone could feel. Arthur remained seated, his hands gripping the armrests, his eyes still fixed on the window. But beneath that calm exterior was a smoldering fire, burning fiercely, just waiting for the right moment to erupt. Once again, no one paid much attention to Arthur Vance until a call from the flight crew came over the intercom system. The sharp crackle of the loudspeakers filled the cabin, and the dry voice of the pilot cut through the silence, shattering it. The flight crew requests that airport security be called to prepare to remove a suspicious passenger from the plane. That announcement landed like a blow to the air, causing the entire cabin to fall silent. All eyes turned to Arthur, but he couldn't feel the shift like he had before. Now, no one bothered to hide their contempt. They looked at him as though he were a criminal, accused, and awaiting his punishment. A public ostracism was unfolding before his eyes, and in this tense atmosphere, Arthur began to feel complete isolation. The flight crew had issued a punishment order, even though he hadn't caused any disruption beyond simply sitting still in first class. This time, no one laughed or made jokes. Instead, they remained silent and waited. The entire cabin felt like it had frozen, as if everything was just a play from which he couldn't escape. The sense of betrayal and accusation weighed heavily on him. Arthur could no longer remain silent. The words, the glances, all of it was pressing him against a wall he could no longer endure. Though he knew he was innocent, here in this plane, he had become an outlaw, a victim of torment with no chance to defend himself. In the cramped, stifling space, the intercom crackled again, this time with an even colder tone than before. They were ready to force him off the plane. But Arthur stayed silent. No panic, no resistance. That restraint was precisely the calm before the storm. This moment was just the first step in his journey, and when this plane landed, everything would change forever. The first-class cabin now felt almost suffocating, with every eye locked on Arthur Vance. The atmosphere was becoming thick and tense, as if an explosion was imminent, an eruption that could no longer be contained. The hushed murmurs and whispers still lingered in the air when suddenly, Arthur stood up. The chair groaned as he rose, shattering the quiet that had enveloped the space. He slowly turned, his steps measured but filled with an unmistakable determination. His eyes scanned each face in the cabin, one by one, as though he were examining them, replaying every humiliation they had imposed upon him. The weight of the atmosphere made the passengers feel as though a wave of cold had washed over them. They exchanged glances, then quickly turned away, avoiding his gaze. He didn't need to say much. His look was like a mirror, revealing the falsehoods, the disrespect they had shown him. Finally, as he stood tall, turning to face those who had ridiculed him, a strange calm settled over him. His voice cracked briefly but then emerged deep and cold. "Are you sure you know who's sitting next to you?" His words struck like a silent explosion, ringing clearly through the cramped cabin. Each word carried the weight of an undercurrent rising to the surface. He wasn't in a rush, just a simple statement, but it held a gravity that suffocated the air. Every passenger in the cabin felt not just the threat, but a growing sense of unease, a quiet fear starting to rise within them. His gaze, deep and unyielding, was no longer the gaze of someone provoked. It was the gaze of a man who had reached his limit. He didn't say anything more, but the words he had just spoken had exposed everything. Each person in the cabin could sense that Arthur Vance was not someone who could be easily humiliated. The cabin fell into an eerie silence. No one daring to speak, no one daring to respond. Each passenger felt like they were trapped in a carefully woven snare, one they couldn't escape. His eyes silently swept over each face, counting the betrayers one by one. But what they didn't know was that the truth about Arthur was waiting to be revealed, and when it was, all those who had mocked him would have to face a rage they could never have imagined. The plane landed in an eerie silence, as though no one in the cabin dared to breathe too loudly. All the passengers were quiet, but not out of respect. Rather, it was out of fear, as if they were waiting for a storm to crash down on them. The ground beneath their feet no longer seemed solid. The sighs of the flight attendants blended with the sound of the wheels touching down, creating a hauntingly light yet intense melody. When the plane came to a complete stop, the cabin door opened, and in that moment, a tense atmosphere enveloped everyone. Two security officers entered, each dressed in black uniforms, their strong frames radiating authority. Their eyes scanned the cabin, searching for the one they were instructed to remove. It was none other than Arthur Vance. The passengers seated nearby dared not look, but they could feel Arthur's presence, no longer the timid man they had mocked. Now he was a man standing on the verge of his liberation, and every step he took was the unfolding of all the pain and anger he had bottled up for so long. The two security officers approached him, their gazes cold and devoid of empathy. But contrary to what they had anticipated, Arthur did not tremble. He didn't bow his head, nor did he walk quietly like a defeated man. On the contrary, he stood tall, like an immovable mountain, solid and unshaken. One of the officers spoke, his voice calm and authoritative. "Mr. Arthur Vance, we have orders to remove you from the plane." The words landed like a heavy blow, reverberating in the minds of the passengers who had been watching. Everything seemed to be unfolding like a temporary end, but in truth, it was only the beginning of what was to come. What no one expected was that Arthur didn't rush, nor did he show any signs of defeat. Instead, he turned slightly to look at the passengers seated nearby, the very ones who had mocked and insulted him earlier. His voice remained low, but it carried power. "I am not to be discarded. I am a person with rights, and I will not let you define me." His words cut through the silence in the cabin like a sharp blade, making those who had ridiculed him feel the pain of the disrespect they had shown him. Arthur's final gaze toward the passengers who had mocked him made them feel as though they were on trial, not by the system, but by the inevitable verdict brought on by the truth he carried with him. The plane didn't just land on the ground. The truth that Arthur brought with him had also landed in the hearts of every passenger, leaving them unable to forget what they had done. The feeling of freedom began to spread within him, as though all the pent-up anger had been released. Nothing could contain him any longer. His truth, his power, was now becoming a weapon no one could have anticipated. As soon as Arthur began to rise from his seat, one of the security officers who had been accompanying his colleague abruptly stopped. His eyes widened in disbelief, unable to comprehend what he had just heard. The entire cabin seemed to freeze for a brief moment, as if all sound had suddenly ceased. "Mr. Vance? Federal Judge Vance." His voice cracked, filled with surprise and panic. Those words struck like a lightning bolt, causing the entire plane cabin to snap out of the suffocating silence. The officer's question felt like a shock to everyone in the cabin, as they began to realize that the man they had been mocking was none other than a man of power, a prominent figure. The plane cabin fell deathly silent. Every eye instantly turned toward Arthur. The mocking glances that had been directed at him were erased by the brutal truth they could no longer deny. People looked at each other, unsure if they had truly understood what had just happened. Arthur stood there unfazed, his deep, dark eyes unwavering. A federal judge, someone who had decided the fate of thousands of cases, someone with power and influence, now treated as though he were a discarded object in first class. If this wasn't a joke, it was a warning to anyone who had ever considered him a nobody. Everything seemed to slow down in the cabin. The shock lingered in the air, and no one dared to speak. A man who had been humiliated, disrespected, was now one of the most powerful people they could imagine. His gaze was not only a punishment for those who had mocked him, but also a wake-up call for everyone that sometimes power is not always something that can be judged by appearances. The tension in the air was so thick that you could almost hear the heartbeat of each passenger. Those who had previously been indifferent now began to feel their own pain. A wave of shame began to rise within them. They had been wrong. They had erred, and now they had to face the truth that they could no longer deny. Arthur remained standing while the security officers began to hesitate. They looked at him, their once confident expressions replaced with confusion. Everything had flipped, and now they were the ones who were being judged. As the security officers' words echoed, a profound silence enveloped the entire cabin. Every eye that had once laughed, mocked Arthur, now averted their gaze, unable to meet his eyes. The silence in the cabin felt like a brutal blow, digging into each person, making them feel like soulless beings. Those who had ridiculed him now found themselves at a loss for words, unable to justify their actions. They realized that they had made a grave mistake, and the price for their carelessness was an indisputable shame. The glances that had been filled with contempt before now were full of regret. They wanted to say something, but all remained silent. Only the strange hum of the plane's engines and the heavy breathing of passengers could be heard as they began to realize just how wrong they had been. The flight attendant who had once coldly dismissed Arthur now took a step back. Her face turned pale, as if all the color had drained from her. What had she done? She had pushed a man to his breaking point, had treated him as an outsider simply because of his appearance, and now she realized that she had made a terrible mistake. In that moment, the flight attendant felt a rush of confusion and humiliation. She could not defend her actions, nor could she say anything to heal the wounds that she and the other passengers had inflicted. The entire cabin fell into silence, as if each person was forced to face a guilty conscience, and none of them could escape the feeling of guilt. The air in the cabin grew stifling and heavy. The overwhelming sense of shame filled the space, and all anyone could do was remain silent, quietly enduring the painful truth they could no longer change. At that moment, Arthur stood there, his gaze steadfast, like a torch cutting through the darkness of injustice. He did not speak further, but his very presence spoke volumes. The cost of discrimination, the contempt he had borne, had now become a costly lesson for all who had once seen him as insignificant. The cabin remained immersed in silence, like a dark, suffocating veil. Arthur's eyes never left those who had ridiculed and criticized him throughout the flight. His gaze was deep, cold, yet carried an undeniable dignity. Finally, Arthur spoke, but his words were not those of a shout or a violent retaliation. His sentence came softly, yet it struck like a sharp blade, cutting through the air and piercing the regret of everyone in the room. I've judged people like you, but today, I don't need a courtroom, because you've just sentenced yourselves. Those words weren't loud or dramatic, but they etched themselves into the hearts of everyone who had mocked him. A truth as cold as violent waves crashing against the shore, drowning out any remaining sound. No one dared to respond. Everything froze. His words were the final verdict, requiring no courtroom, no evidence, just a glance, a sentence, and the terrifying silence of those whose true faces had been exposed. Arthur didn't need to say anything more. It was the silence of those who had once considered him an outsider, now the irrefutable evidence. They had judged themselves with their ignorance, disdain, and discriminatory attitudes. And now, they had to face the truth. They were the criminals, not him. The space now fell silent. Only the silence of fear remained, the fear of those who knew they were wrong but couldn't undo what had already been done. After the plane landed, everyone was still in a state of disbelief over the truth Arthur had exposed. Those who had laughed at him, mocked him, now could not lift their heads. Their eyes were glued to the floor, avoiding the rising shame within them. But Arthur did not stop there. Anger was no longer his only emotion. It had now become action. He didn't demand compensation or revenge. He wanted justice, but in a way only someone who had once stood at the pinnacle could achieve. He didn't need to resort to violence or degrade others. Instead, he called for a press conference. Journalists appeared almost immediately, and with Arthur's strong direction, the video capturing the entire incident on the flight was released just hours after landing. The video not only showed the moments people had disrespected him, but it was also clear evidence of racism and the blatant lack of respect from those they called first-class passengers. The video quickly became a sensation, not only grabbing the media's attention, but also sparking a wave of reactions online. Within 24 hours, the video had amassed millions of views, shares, and comments. The actions of the passengers with their discriminatory attitudes, the indifferent flight attendants, were now scrutinized under the harsh light of public scrutiny. Arthur's image was no longer just that of a man who had been ridiculed. He had now become a symbol of justice. The mockery, the discrimination, was now laid bare before the world, and he was the one who stood up to restore justice, not just for himself, but for all those who had been mistreated, degraded, or belittled simply because of their race or social status. Each comment, each line of sharing under the video became a wave of change, a call for justice that no one could ignore. Those who had once mocked him now only had silence left, surrounded by the very crowd that was now condemning them. And even though they didn't want to admit it, every moment they watched the video was a strong indictment against themselves. Arthur's emotions were not driven by wild anger or bursting fury. It was the determination in his actions. Through this press conference, he proved that sometimes the silence of truth is the one thing that can bring justice. When Arthur's video spread, the world could no longer stand by and watch the racist behavior and disrespect he had endured. The reflection didn't stop with those who had directly witnessed the incident. It spread throughout society. Immediately, major airlines began implementing retraining policies for their entire flight crews, not only to ensure safety, but to emphasize the need for respect and equality for all passengers, regardless of race or social status. Flight attendant training academies were instructed to revise their curriculums, incorporating lessons on cultural awareness, personal respect, and social justice. This change didn't just appear within airlines. Large corporations, from high-end restaurants to global customer service industries, began to reevaluate the discriminatory policies they had inadvertently upheld for so long. A revolution for human rights seemed to have been ignited by the story of one black man, not just for an hour, but for an entire generation now calling for real change. The powerful spread of the video and the message Arthur conveyed made several influential figures reconsider how they carried out their work and how they viewed others. The passengers who had shown disrespect to Arthur now had to face severe criticism from the public and the online community. A powerful hashtag emerged, "No More Silence," alongside the spread of his video. This hashtag became a symbol of the fight against racism and respect for individual rights. People began using the hashtag to share personal stories of the injustices they had faced in life, not only at airports or on flights, but everywhere in society. Posts under this hashtag were not just stories, but calls to action, asserting that no one should stay silent when witnessing injustice. People from all walks of life, those who had long been afraid to speak out, now found strength in Arthur's story and dared to stand up against discrimination. His story was not only a wake-up call, but also a flame that ignited hope for the oppressed. From being ridiculed, Arthur had now become a role model, someone who had dared to stand up in a world full of silence and injustice, delivering a clear message that silence would no longer be tolerated. And when someone like him spoke out, the entire world had to listen. After Arthur's video went viral, a powerful awakening wave surged across society. Those who had once remained silent, fearful, or even felt powerless in the face of societal injustices now began to speak out. Thousands of people across social media platforms began sharing their similar experiences of discrimination. Stories of racism, economic disparity, and the disdain shown by those in power weren't confined to first-class flights, but were found in every facet of life, from office environments to schools, from luxury restaurants to government institutions. A global movement was beginning to take shape, where people no longer hesitated to denounce the injustices they had suffered for so long. Those carrying the pain of racial or social discrimination had now found their voices through Arthur's story. His story became a symbol of zero tolerance for discriminatory actions, and it was also a strong call to eradicate such disparities. The outpouring of support wasn't limited to those who had been discriminated against, but also included allies advocating for justice and the rights of all individuals. A wave of solidarity rose from the community, with thousands of posts, videos, and comments from individuals and organizations fighting for justice, creating a mutual support system. These small actions, when accumulated, formed a powerful movement, shaking public opinion and even influencing political decisions and policy changes. Social leaders began to realize they could no longer remain silent. Heads of large organizations, multinational companies, and even politicians could no longer ignore the growing demands for justice. They were forced to face the truth that society could not continue as it had. The racial discrimination and systemic injustices must be dismantled. Meanwhile, Arthur was not an isolated figure. People like him, who had quietly endured and turned a blind eye, now found strength in the community to speak out. Together, they began to build a massive campaign to demand that governments and international organizations change how they treated the disadvantaged and protect their rights. Arthur's story was not just a personal confrontation. It became a small revolution in reshaping societal perceptions of justice and human rights. It served as a reminder that no one can stand on the sidelines when injustice persists, and we, no matter who we are, all have the right to speak out when we see wrongdoing.